I went in the shop, I said, I just want a plain hat. They said, sorry mate, we've only got helicopters. I have been getting some positive feedback on these speakers. This is, of course, the Tronsmart Halo 100. Turns out there's a Tronsmart Halo 110, and that's the karaoke version of this speaker. So the Halo 100 is not karaoke, it doesn't have the mic input, doesn't come with a mic, but Halo 110 does. So I did contact Tronsmart. I said, hey, any chance of getting the Halo 110, because it's exactly the same sound, but with the karaoke features that it can be quite fun. They said, sorry mate, not available yet, but we're happy to send you not one, but two Tronsmart Halo 100s, and I went for it. It's an interesting speaker. Why is it interesting, Al? Well, I'm going to tell you. This because it has not one, not two, but three tweeters. And that's pretty unusual, and that's maybe ringing alarm bells for some people. Could that be a marketing ploy, or have they really found a design that works? Of course, in the headlines, it sounds fantastic because they say, have a three-way. And when is that not a good thing? Well, possibly when you've got three tweeters that close together. Remember, we've got a woofer, we've got a passive radiator, we've got quite a stiff passive radiator. Maybe that's a clue that it's tuned quite low. We'll get onto that soon. And we've got one woofer, but the difference is low frequency, high frequency, three close together drivers all producing high frequency. I'm not a DIYer, I've said it many times. I can only go by my basic knowledge on this subject, but that in my head, I'm thinking, doesn't that mean the higher possibility of interference quite early, because they're very short waves, sound waves, just like your ocean waves, sound waves, low frequency, very, very close together. Almost immediately, they're going to start interfering with each other, which means you start getting the peaks and the nulls where you don't want cancellations, where you don't want them. Whereas low frequencies, much longer waves, so long at the base, it can go through a wall, whereas these will reflect. Of course, they all have the potential for interference, but even more so in my very basic knowledge of the maths involved. There is maths involved because it also depends on the size of the drivers and the distance between the drivers. But to me, this rings alarm bells because these are budget speakers. But remember, this retails around $90, 90 quid. Sounds like, you know, a party speaker at 90 quid with lots of lovely lights going on. Maybe this is the time to dive in with Tronsmart. But it's hard enough to get one crossover right. How are they going to... Now, why are they saying three tweeters? Obviously, they're trying to give some sense of stereo with two tweeters. They're calling this other one a mid-tweeter. And I was wondering, is that a mid because it's midway between the other two? Or is it mid because it's not... Well, it's not going to cover... Look at the size of it. It's smaller than the other tweeters. It's not going to cover the mids. It's going to cover part of the higher frequency. So we're going to get into all that. They do say it's a 60-watt speaker. Well, I've seen the teardowns, and we do know actually, in this case, the 60-watt refers to the actual drivers. That's rated 30 watts. We have two 12-watt tweeters, so it's 2454, and a 6-watt tweeter. So 60 watts, we know in this case, actually refers to the drivers. You do get lovely, lovely auxiliary, and you do have a micro SD card slot to play straight off the device, and you have your USB-C connection input to charge, and you have USB-A out as a power bank. I've taken these off because I want to show you, this is a tight old cover. It's not like, oh, we've got lots of air gaps around the side, around the back. In fact, this is the Soundcore. I bought out two Tronsmarts on the table, and there's a clue how similar they look. But I will get me Tronsmart. This is my second Tronsmart, and whereas on the, because it looks a lot like the Rave Neo. This is the original Rave Neo. There is another Rave Neo now with two tweeters. This has the one with one full-range driver. And there's lots of gap around the side there. Whereas on this one, it's pretty much sealed. In fact, two sealed. And I would say probably better off taking the cover off altogether. It's not too badly exposed. You're not going to change any waterproofing. Now, they say that in the specs as well. They do say this is good for in the pool. Actually say in the pool. Well, it's IP6. That's splash proof. Something to bear in mind. You're not ruining any, IPX7 being able to submerge it. It's only splash proof. Don't put it in the pool, as they mention. You can go in the app and there's multiple EQs. You might as well just quickly mention. They've got the default, the sound pulse, which is the EQ button there to go on and off. There's a deep bass button in the app. Like see on there. There's a rock, there's a classical, and there's a customized. So there's a promise of customized EQ. It looks like it's not embedded, by the way, if you do a custom EQ. Looks like it just remembers it in the app, and sometimes it resets itself. That's what it's been doing for me. But soundpulse, they're patented, they're patented form of DSP. What do they say about that? Now, here's the thing. On this speaker, to activate your soundpulse, it actually is, you actually have to press that. It's not something that it's there all the time. It's just their particular DSP, which they call an upgraded version of DSP. We're going to have a look at the frequency response measurements of this Halo 100. Default mode, you can see if we take the bass, we've got an upward slant, so already it looks on the bright side. It looks quite wavy. So we've got definite peaks around 15 kilohertz, 6 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, 500 hertz, and that bass peak quite high at 100 hertz. Rapid roll off from 90 hertz is looking like very little deep bass here, and also very little adjustment. We have some bass adjustment. Look at the bass peak relative to the rest of the frequency response. As we go up in volume, that gradually reduces, but not by much, and very little adjustments going on. So the on-speaker EQ button gives us sound pulse mode. Not a hell of a lot of difference. It just looks like it's going a little bit louder and a little bit brighter. We need to overlay them to see the real differences. As we can see, it's doing that little trick, going a little bit louder all over. Going to sound slightly more dynamic to your ears just because of that. But if we compare the low end to the high end, we can see it's an upward slant. It's going brighter. And of course, we also have the deep bass mode, which probably looks the most interesting, but a quick glance, I don't see the deep bass. Comparing it to default, we've got a mid bass push, and by doing that, we get a bit more extension. It's still rolling off from 80 hertz and down. And if you look closely, what it's actually doing, there's a bit of a push, say 500 hertz and down in the bass with that, and culminating in that bass peak. But also at the high end, 2 kilohertz and down, it starts reducing some of the highs to emphasize the bass a bit more. So it does look a bit wavy. Now, a lot of you have been telling me it's got some decent bass. Obviously, we talked about many times, upper bass, mid bass, deep bass. I'm a deep bass fan, and a lot of you I know are upper bass fans. This is a mid bass heavy speaker. So there's a big push in the mid bass, and there's very little, it looks like, deep bass. As for the sound pulse, well, all that appears to be doing, it goes a bit brighter and a tad louder.
I scream, nobody hears, but I see the light from far away. It's down the line. Maybe I should not give up without a fight, 'cause there will be a time. Oh, 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 oh. There will be a time. Oh, 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 oh. There will be a time.
What I am seeing is it's quite linear. There's hardly any adjustment for volume. So we're used to seeing lots of bass adjustment at lower volumes. What do we mean? Obviously, they're pushing the bass more, then it comes down. And then a lot of these speakers, JBL and the like, limiting at 80%. And after that, you just get the mids and highs. Actually, this looks quite linear from 0 to 100%. Those drivers, we need to talk. So let's have a look at what I've, in my measurements. I don't disconnect because, first of all, these are soldered. So just know I'm doing it my own way, but trying to work out what each of the drivers is doing, and this is what I think the drivers are doing. So looking at the woofer, we see that mid-bass peak, but it's also as much in the mid-bass as it is in the upper bass, but we don't have deep bass. It's rolling off pretty heavily from 90 hertz, and we can see rolling right off at 2.5 kilohertz, which is going to be our crossover. It's interesting to look at the passive radiator, given that we've got no deep bass, but we do have a slight nudge around the 40 to 50 hertz mark, even though it's completely rolled off. And looking at the passive radiator, that indeed is where the passive radiator is tuned. It's tuned too low, around 45 hertz, but the woofer has got no energy down there. So, in my opinion, there's a mismatch between the tuning of the passive radiator and the woofer. So the mid-tweeter is indeed the mids of the highs, so-called. It's not that it's midway between the other two tweeters, because there is our peak on the mid-tweeter from 4.5 kilohertz, and then quite flat. And looking at the main tweeters, we can see they pick up from the 10 kilohertz mark, and they've got an incredible peak around 15 kilohertz. So most of the work is being done by that top tweeter. That passive radiator looks to be tuned at 45 hertz, yet the woofer's tailing off from about 90 hertz. So the passive radiator would normally be tuned at the point it starts to roll off. It still needs to be able to drive that passive. Passive, it means the woofer is driving it. It needs to be at the point it rolls off and reinforce that area, not at the point it's already rolled off, which is where it appears to be. So there is some bass down there, 45 hertz, and you'd think, oh, it's a deep bass monster, but it isn't, because it's a mismatch now between the tuning of the passive radiator and the roll-off in the woofer. So we've got a deep bass mode. Phew! We've got a deep bass mode. Maybe that's going to do some magic. We can also play with a custom. I'm trying to eke out some more deep bass because the biggest issue for me with this is the mid bass push. So to do that, I have pushed the bass, not to the maximum. I've pushed it a reasonable amount, and I've reduced the mids and the highs, which will give a more bass heavy sound without having to push that woofer and that very deeply tuned passive radiator too much. I'm going to compare default mode, the deep bass mode, and my custom mode.
It's alright, girl, you got me sleepless, begging, barely breathing. My kryptonite, but you feel so right. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness. You got me sleepless. You know you're my weakness. Got me on my knees, yeah. My kryptonite, but you feel so right, girl. You got me sleepless, begging, barely breathing. My kryptonite, but you feel so right. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness. It's alright, girl, you got me sleepless, begging, barely breathing. My kryptonite, but you feel so right. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness. You got me sleepless. You know you're my weakness. Got me on my knees, yeah. My kryptonite, but you feel so right, girl. You got me sleepless, begging, barely breathing. My kryptonite, but you feel so right. You know you're my weakness. You know you're my weakness.
So trying to get a bit more bass by pushing the bass in the app and slightly reducing the rest of the frequency response. Yes, overall quite leveled out, but look where the bass is getting pushed in the middle of the mids and the upper bass. So it's around that 100 hertz mark. It's exactly where I didn't want it. Don't want to hear more of the upper bass. I wanted more bass extension. And so when we compare that to default and deep bass mode, in terms of that deep bass mode and grabbing hold of that passive radiator, only deep bass mode does it. It's got a bit more extension from 60 hertz and down, which is where I want to hear it. And indeed, it's got more mids compared to default. And pushing the bass is just too much mid bass push. You can't get any more bass extension, unfortunately, using the EQ in the app. And of course, deep bass mode, the green line, we've got more bass, but
It's also reducing the mids and highs, as we kind of have expected, to emphasize the deeper bass sound.
Unfortunate that you can't push the deep bass. You can only push the mid bass. Some of you will love that. Me personally, I don't like that. That's too much, because it's right on the borders of mid bass and upper bass, and I don't like that pushed too much. Some of you will love that, and also outdoors it'll work better. They do talk about this being, well, a party speaker along with some other claims. However, moving deep bass is the only mode that's going to give you deep bass, more deep bass. So I'm going forward with that. It does look to be some sort of clone of the Rave Neo. This is not the Rave Neo 2. This is the Rave Neo original with the one tweeter. So the Rave Neo versus the Tronsmart Halo 100 in its deep bass mode, and that's with my custom mode.
Let's get big until I forget my name. Let's get big. Jump right, slide to the left. Let's get big. Make it up while you can, and let's do it again. Let's get big. If you wanna dance, I can tell you about this place I know, somewhere hidden in the stars. I know don't waste your energy, even though we're 23. Gotta give you roll tonight. Let's get big. My name, let's get big. Let's get big. Let's get big.
For me, I prefer the Rave Neo. The weird thing is that they're both quite wavy, even in custom modes. There's only so much you can do. And the waves, the peak waves and the dips are opposite to each other. So one will suit you more than the other, but for me, the Rave Neo wins every day of the week at these volumes. We'll see what happens at maximum volumes. So the biggest issue for, with the three tweeters, and yet this massive gap between 6 and 12 kilohertz on the Tronsmart, exactly where there's a bit of a peak. Obviously, I pushed it in the custom, but they are doing that in opposite. And then again, about 1.5 to 2.5 kilos peaking with that mid-tweeter on the Tronsmart, but dipping with its single tweeter on the Rave Neo. In terms of that bass, though, it wins all day long for the Rave Neo until you get to the crossover not crossover, until you get where the passive radio is kicking in. About 45 hertz and down, there is some deep bass, but it's lost because the woofer's not really going to drive it very well, and there's a disconnect between between the deep bass and the mid bass. But the deep bass is there, not bad. Just not as good as the Rave Neo, which appears to be a clone. You can't get that anymore. When it was retailing, it was 114 quid, and this is £90. Let's compare it to something else. Let's compare it to the JBL Xtreme 3. Maybe you say, well, you can't be serious. The £90, $90 Halo 100 against the extremely priced 244 quid, $300 when I last checked on Amazon. Seems to be a mismatch of epic proportions. Well, the good news for the Tronsmart is there isn't a million miles between them. And again, a lot of it's going to come down to tuning and the way you listen. Don't forget, 2 of those are still cheaper than 1 of those. And you probably say, well, why didn't you play 2 of them? Well, I can't do everything in one video. It's already 3 days long, isn't it?
3 days later.
So, the thing about the JBL Xtreme 3 is it's got particular tuning. It's got a big, narrow 60 hertz peak for its bass. They know its user audience, and they know you're going to be playing lots of electronic music, lots of bass-heavy music, and they're going all out, balls in, 60 hertz, because you're just going to love the bass it gives you. And then there's a 6 kilohertz peak. That's probably going to, you see, that's the thing. It's not so much the frequency, but the overall frequency slope of the tracks you play. And the bass-heavy electronic music will tend to have a downward slope. So you're not getting so much of the highs. And when you add a 6 kilohertz peak, it's making up for some of that, and it just sounds balanced to you. You've got to remember, all these are mixed different depending on how they think you're going to listen and what you're going to listen on. So I think they're tuning this for what they think sort of music you're going to play, not for an all-round genre type of speaker, so-called audiophiles, where it's quite balanced. It's a real instrument, as you keep telling me. And if you look at a spectrum analysis of a lot of these tracks, it's quite gentle and slope. And you put that 6 kilohertz peak in, and suddenly it sounds quite harsh. And therefore, a lot of the tuning on these speakers is because they know they use a bass. It's going to depend on what you kind of listen to. You're not going to get the all-round speakers that you're going to get in the audiophile world, and you've got a proper hi-fi setup, and it is all about getting absolute flat frequency response at the listener's ears. Then these peaks will sound awful. So this has got a 15 kilohertz peak, and that, under any scenario, scratch my head, because a lot of people can't even hear 15 kilohertz. Those who, and what are you getting there? Well, the idea would be you could it's into the harmonics. There's not many real instruments you're going to hear there. Certainly, when you say any tuning, to be fair, a lot more, even the ones that have got a downward slope, or well, even the ones that are flat, tailing off before 15 kilohertz. They put it in there. It's hard. For me, it just adds an electronic nature. Got to put it in, because it's the one, the sub $100, £100 speakers I got to live up to. Who is it? It's the Motion Boom.
Can't get a job that pays us enough. I'm about to pop off. Fuck you, you're lost. We all know that we never really want a boss. So I'ma do what I want to. Something I can't undo. Yeah, I'ma do what I want to. Something I can't undo. I'm taking 6 shots, yeah, straight to the face. And I wanna get lost, I'm sick of this place. Don't know how to stop when I'm feeling this way. So I'm taking 6 shots till I'm feeling okay. I think I'm going crazy. Don't think I'll get home safe. So I'm taking 6 shots, all straight to the face. I'm taking 6 shots, are you coming with me? I'm taking 6 shots, yeah, straight to the face. And I wanna get lost, I'm sick of this place. Don't know how to stop when I'm feeling this way. So I'm taking 6 shots till I'm feeling okay. I think I'm going crazy. Don't think I'll get home safe. So I'm taking 6 shots, all straight to the face. I'm taking 6 shots, are you coming with me?
Comparing all 4 speakers when playing the same track. Remember, not a frequency response, it's a spectrum analysis. Some standouts, the custom mode on the Motion Boom, which you got to push to match the bass, so it is pretty V-shaped. You do get a nice dollop of bass, but it's not the most extended. The Rave Neo is kind of nudging ahead in terms of the mid bass. The Xtreme 3 has a extreme bass peak. It's at 60 hertz, and that's where it dominates over the Motion Boom, but then it rolls off rapidly. And as you can see, from 50 hertz and down, it's got the least bass of all. The Rave Neo has probably the smoothest bass, again in custom mode. Bit more extension than the Motion Boom, 50 hertz and down. But look what's happening here. 45 hertz, we already talked about the passive radiator being tuned too low on the Halo. It's got the most bass extension, but you're not going to hear it. It's below. It's beyond where everything else is starting to roll off. So you've got a little bit of a sense of that, but it's a big miss for me. And it's tied to the wavy nature. Look at the peaks standing out above everything else. The 450 hertz mark, 2 kilohertz mark, and then the big miss. 3 tweeters, but a big hole in the high end. 7 kilohertz to about 12 kilohertz is missing.
So yeah, it is with my custom mode. Got to remember the price on this when I last checked. 68 quid, $99. $90. So in the US it appears this is a little bit cheaper. In the UK it appears this is a little bit cheaper. Completely different form factors. I was doing it with just 2 drivers. I was doing it with 4 drivers. 3 tweeters, no tweeters. I have tuned that very V-shaped. That's for me what gets the best out of it. You'll notice more. You might have noticed my peak on that is around what, the 10 kilohertz. I talked about 10 kilohertz above unit harmonics. For me, where you can and can't push, that's for me. Your taste may vary, and pushing anything for some people is the end of the world. But it has to balance the push on. This is all about its deep bass. Have pushed the deep bass. And to me, you've got to balance it with that high end, and it's got no tweeters. But I acknowledge it gives it a kind of hazy, funky sound at the high end because of where it's been pushed. And I said, that's the problem. Might as well go to maximum headroom. Already said potential appears to be at maximum volumes, louder volumes, where there doesn't seem to be any real limiting in the bass. And it's kind of just below these other speakers at these lower volumes, and these others all start limiting at 80%. But before that, we need to go through all the EQs you're likely to use to see which one works best at maximum volume, and then we'll go ahead with that one against the other speakers. So what we got? We've got the soundpulse patented DSP upgraded DSP apparently, painted by Tronsmart. We've got the default mode, we've got the deep bass mode, and we've got custom mode where you can really push the mid bass. We'll have a listen to which one goes loudest and which one seems most satisfying at maximum volume. In terms of comparing all the EQ modes, which is going to work best at high volume, for me it's the soundpulse EQ mode, but there isn't that much in it between the lot of them. Yes, custom mode, we already mentioned, has the most mid-bass push, if that's what you want, but then it has the biggest roll-off because it doesn't touch the deep bass at all, and that's the white line there. That's followed in terms of the bass by deep bass mode, which has the next biggest mid-bass, and indeed the deep bass, but it's got no impact further up, and indeed it's got the biggest roll-off in the high end of all the modes. Default mode has the least in terms of overall bass, and that leaves soundpulse mode because it's just behind deep bass mode for deep bass. Yes, it's rolled off, and yes, it's behind a couple of the others for mid bass, but not by much, and it retains the most high end. So I think overall it's got the most impact in terms of overall volume. There's nothing in it between all these modes, and it's really that high end now at maximum volume that makes it stand out on soundpulse mode. So custom mode, you can get more in terms of that mid bass. If that's what you want, then that's fine. In terms of absolute maximum volume, in terms of lufts across the whole track, it is default mode, and indeed the peaks. But for a sound that gels at maximum volume, that has the most impact, and you're probably most likely to use, for me, at maximum volumes, indoor, outdoor, would be soundpulse mode. So I'm going ahead. Soundpulse mode versus the other three speakers. Maximum pulls out the maximum 100% volume.
So who goes the absolute loudest? It's the Rave Neo in custom mode. There is nothing between all 4 modes in actual overall loudness. There's a decibel between the Rave Neo and the soundpulse, and a similar story in terms of the peaks. And that mid-bass push of the soundpulse is probably the standout here. That makes it, at maximum volume, the most bass heavy overall of all 4 speakers here, thanks to that mid-bass push. From 50 Hz and down, the too low tuned passive radiator is helping it be the most extended in terms of the deep bass, but it does have the biggest high-end roll-off due to that big hole in the tweeters. The JBL Xtreme with its big roll-off bass but retaining its 6 kHz peak, it's a bit piercing on the ears. The Rave Neo also has its big peak around 3.5 kHz, is where most of its volume is coming from. Maybe the best all-round of the others is the Motion Boom, but all similar enough in overall volume and different enough in actual tuning that one of these 4 will suit your taste in some way, if indeed loud listening is what you're looking for.
Already said the Motion Boom and the Rave Neo would have been a bit better in default mode, but I've left it in custom mode because that's what I used at low volumes. So we're seeing how it holds up against the Halo. When you're going through volume steps, we have gone for sound pulse mode on the Halo 100. I think that has the most impact because it's the best balance between the highs and the lows at maximum volume. We said it would probably come into its own near at maximum volume. Indeed it did. Do you know what? There's very little between all 4 speakers, just a decibel between them in absolute maximum volume, a decibel and a half in terms of the peaks. In terms of delivering that deep bass, that passive radiator is still doing its thing. Would have had a bit more oomph if it was tuned a bit higher, or indeed if the woofer came down a bit low, maybe it was a better woofer. So a decibel up at least in overall bass. In terms of that deep bass, measuring it at 40 Hz, yes, it's well tailed off and it's not going to sound great. But at 40 Hz, which is where about as low as these speakers can really go, it's 8 decibels up, which is crazy. But if you take overall bass, say 30 Hz to 60 Hz, and take the overall volume, then they're all about the same. So there's too much of a roll-off for me on the Rave Neo. The Xtreme 3 comes a bit squeaky with that 6 kHz peak. Again, going to depend on what kind of tracks you're playing, but it's all about that 60 Hz mark. So it's not great overall bass. Quite honestly, I think this holds up well at maximum volume. That's where it comes into its own. But there was a song called Hats Off to Larry. You've never heard of it. It's because even for me, it was before my time. It was a great song by Del Shannon. Go on YouTube it now. Hats off to Larry. I only said that because that came right in my mind as I went like that with a hat. And by the way, it is one of those songs I used to party out to, get ready for a night out. So we're going to go over the specs. We have an absolute shocker here because where are they all made? They're made in China. We didn't talk about prices. JBL Xtreme price 3. When I last checked, 244 quid, $299. It don't come cheap. But that's what you're going to have to pay if you want a 60 Hz peak and a 6 kHz peak. Incredible value still today. A classic £68.99. Don't know why so much in the US, but maybe you know where to get it at a discount. Soundcore Rave Neo. Well, the Neo 2, of course, but this was around $120 at the time. I should have checked. The Rave Neo 2, you're absolutely correct. And of course, 90 quid, $90. It's in that budget area where, yes, it's something to consider. In terms of the batteries, now here's the thing. 36.3 watt hours for the Xtreme 3. 37 watt hours, almost the same for the Motion Boom. And 36 watt hours for the Rave Neo. Almost exactly the same. They're already taking aim at each other, kind of. But hang on a second. It's 44.4 watt hours. It's a big battery on the Halo 100. So I know they talk about it's got 18 hours of playtime. But of course, we don't take any notice of that. It depends on how you use it, what kind of music, what volumes. Just know it's got the biggest battery, by quite a margin. It's got the biggest battery, likely to, and without having massive deep bass, likely to have, well, by far, probably the best battery life. They're all SBC, of course. Bluetooth 5.1 for the Xtreme 3, Bluetooth 5 for the Motion Boom, Bluetooth 5 for the Rave Neo, of course it's the older speaker, and 5.3 is the latest Bluetooth for the Tronsmart Halo 100. They all do true wireless stereo pairing, but only the JBL Xtreme 3 and the Rave Neo will also do party mode with additional speakers. All got USB-C connections. all got auxiliary input except for the Soundcore Motion Boom. Oh, so near but so far. No auxiliary input. Can all be used as a power bank. Can all be used to make phone calls except for the JBL Xtreme 3. We know JBL have been pulling features that they used to give for a long time. For some reason, no speakerphone functionality. Only speaker on this table that has a micro SD slot, TF card slot. You can play your track straight off the device itself. No other device is needed. I know a lot of you really like that feature. We don't take any notice, and I've already demonstrated how they measure the 60 watts. This is not like proper hi-fi where they measure the amp and they tell you what load into, and you know exactly whether it's RMS peak or whatever. But I will tell you the headline specs. They're saying 50 watts on AC. Their Motion Boom is saying 30 watts. Soundcore Rave Neo says 50 watts and they say 60 watts. We've done the loudness test. You don't need to know that. They all charge at 5 volts, 2 amps, which is 10 watts, except for the JBL Xtreme 3, which has a mains lead, doesn't it? No, it's not. But it's not. But it's got high power USB-C. It's with their charger. You can charge at 60 watts. So it's 6 times as fast to charge that battery. That's not insignificant. The heaviest on the table is 2.9, basically 3 kilos for the Rave Neo, 2.7 kilos for the Halo 100, say 2 kilos for the Xtreme 3, and just 1.5 kilos. It's hanging with these fat boys, just 1.5 kilos for the Soundcore Motion Boom. They all have IP7 rating except for the Halo 100. I mentioned right at the beginning, they talk about having it in a pool, but of course, don't do that. It's not waterproof rated. It's splash proof. It's not waterproof. These others, IP7 means you can submerge it for 30 minutes in up to 1 meter of water. Additionally, the Xtreme 3 is IP67, the 6 meaning it's dust proof. In terms of those drivers, the Xtreme 3, 2 65mm woofers, 220mm tweeters, 2 passive radiators. The Motion Boom, 2 65mm woofers and 2 passive radiators. The thing about those woofers are it's got titanium drivers. The Rave Neo, a single 110mm woofer and a 60mm full range driver, whereas the Tronsmart Halo has a 90mm woofer, 245mm tweeters, and what they call a mid tweeter at 25mm. So they all have tweeters except for the Motion Boom. The auxiliary lag. So if you're DJing or something like that and you're using speakers like this, or for whatever, if you want to movies off your laptop or whatever, it's really important to know the lag on auxiliary. The trouble is a lot of these modern speakers still put the auxiliary input through their DSP and it adds delay. But on these speakers, the JBL Xtreme 3, it's got 33 millisecond delay on auxiliary. For DJs, that's make or break, so you wouldn't want that. But for movies, that's well usable. For me, 80 milliseconds is my cutoff point for where you start noticing it or where it becomes annoying. We don't have an auxiliary on the Motion Boom, but on both the Rave Neo and the Halo 100, you'll be pleased to hear no lag at all. 0 milliseconds, just as you'd want. Auxiliary input, no Bluetooth latency. Of course, it's not Bluetooth, but there's no latency. In terms of the Bluetooth, the Halo, hey, is the absolute stonking bargain here. On Bluetooth, as good as it gets, I measured 33 milliseconds of delay. That's brilliant. That means even on Bluetooth, you're going to be fine for YouTube, streaming and all that. You're not really going to notice any lip sync. That's as good as it gets. But the JBL Xtreme 3, 100 milliseconds is not good. The Motion Boom, 160 milliseconds, that's really, really bad. And the Rave Neo, an unbelievable 233 milliseconds. I mean, that's like playing your music today or speaking today, and the next day you start hearing, that's terrible, that's terrible. All got an app, all got EQ in the app, but as far as I can see, the EQ does not embed with the Halo 100. And worse than that, sometimes you go into the app and it's reset itself. Whereas the others embed, you can go device to device. That's pretty much a wrap. Only took me 2 hours to get here, but I got there, and you knew I would, and you got here probably half an hour ago because you skipped right to the conclusion. However, the conclusion is not bad for Tronsmart. Not the greatest speaker ever, but certainly it's an option. Price just about right. There are things to like and not like about it, but it comes into its own 80% and above where the others start limit, and that doesn't limit. And hey ho, you know, sound pulse, the patented sound pulse mode does offer something at maximum volumes. There you go. Didn't ask for it, but I gave it to you anyway. The Tronsmart Halo 100. I hope Tronsmart, you know, I haven't put them off. I put everybody else off. Nobody else contacts me at all or even replies if I ask to talk to them. I hope to see you in another video. Thank you for watching this one for as far as you got, and let's do it again someday.